Last week, we saw that the new British 8th Army wasn't really up to scratch. Equipment and doctrines were out of date, and their leaders were, perhaps, not the right men for the job. But it was these leaders who were coming up with a new plan for the new offensive. They were not tank men, but they were planning a tank battle. Yeah. It's time to look at the plan for Operation Crusader. Notes and sources will be in the pinned comment, timestamps to various parts of the video will be in the description. In September 1941, Italian General Cesare Ame, head of Italy's Servizio Informazioni Militare or SIM, obtained keys to the American embassy in Rome. They walked in, opened the safe, took the contents back to their HQ, photographed them, then put them back. And the Americans didn't realise what had happened and had no idea that their black code encryption system had been hacked. The Italians were now able to intercept US diplomatic messages coming from Cairo, which put them in a strong negotiating position with the Germans, who they didn't pass the black code onto. And during this period, American Colonel Bonner Fellers at Cairo was sending messages back to the Military Intelligence Division in Washington. To compound the problem, Fellers was a committed Anglophobe and also ruthlessly ambitious. He saw that the high profile that his messages generated for him provided potential career opportunities in the future. Sadly, his messages were invariably negative and were designed to present Britain's activities in North Africa in the worst possible light. Within hours of transmission, Rommel was reading in detail of his adversary's plans, enjoying his discomfort, and then adapting his own plans accordingly. Rommel referred to Fellers as de gute quelle, the good source. It wasn't until the 26th of June 1942 that this good source was finally discovered and quelled by the British. But the British would have the benefit of good intelligence as well, due to an agent known as the Gauleiter of Mannheim, who parachuted into Palestine in July 1941 and got caught by a Palestinian farmer. I just want to point out that this event seems to be a bit of a debate in itself, so some elements of it may be embellished. Either way, an agent was caught along with a radio transmitter, identification signals, along with specific times of transmissions. Brigadier Shearer, head of British intelligence in the Middle East, was soon on the case, providing accurate information to the Germans which could be confirmed by German espionage networks in Egypt. Having gained the Germans' trust, they then sent a signal saying that Auchinleck was visiting 9th Army HQ and that lots of dust clouds could be seen showing troop movements heading north. The conclusion given was because the British were moving troops towards the Caucasus to help the Soviet Union and safeguard their oil supplies in the Persian Gulf. The preparations for an attack in the Western Desert were in fact a ruse and could be safely dismissed. German intelligence back home informed Rommel, who was completely won over to this idea, to the point that when he saw photographs that showed the British extending the railway line westwards from Mersa Matruh, Rommel threw the photographs to the floor and refused to look at them. In the desert itself, the British, and the Germans as well, had difficulty finding out what the enemy were up to, or even the position of their forces. This was because of the desert landscape, which, in addition to sandstorms and weather that obscured view, it was so barren and featureless in places it was hard to pinpoint exactly where they actually were. As a result, the RAF reports often made little sense. But the British armoured car reconnaissance reports were generally quite accurate, and as the intelligence was being gathered from both sides, the plan for Operation Crusader got underway. Auchinleck's overall mission was to capture the whole of Cyrenaica, which is the western part of Libya. Doing so would free the port of Tobruk and allow the British a chance to rid the Axis from North Africa for good. In order to capture Cyrenaica, he would have to defeat the Axis armour first. He therefore prepared two broad plans for the future offensive and left it for General Cunningham to decide which he thought was best. In early September, Cunningham looked at the plans. The first was an advance from Jarabub through to Jalo and then to the coast. This would cut the Axis supply lines and encircle the Axis forces in Cyrenaica. The other plan was to attack towards Tobruk, with a feint attack in the south to draw the Axis attention away from the main event. Cunningham did not see the benefit of attacking towards Benghazi from the south. He guessed that the enemy had enough stocks in the forward areas to allow him to counter the British. He thought that supply problems would become too great on the journey and it would probably lead to a dispersal of his armoured strength over Cyrenaica. On the other hand, he thought that a move towards Tobruk would force the enemy to react because Rommel couldn't afford Tobruk to be relieved. And this plan would have the benefit of allowing the British to concentrate their armour against the German panzers, which would hopefully give them the advantage because of superior numbers. Therefore, the Tobruk plan was chosen and more detailed planning began. On the 28th of September 1941, Cunningham submitted his plan for 8th Army's first offensive. Cunningham wanted the army to be split into 4 pieces. The first piece would be Reed's Oasis Force, which would move across the desert towards Jalo. This would capture the nearby landing grounds, allowing the RAF to strike the coastal area south of Benghazi. In addition, the Oasis Force was also to harass the enemy where possible and give off the impression that a major move was being made in the south. Dummy tanks, camps, dumps, and fake wireless traffic were all given to add to the illusion. Plus, the long-range desert group is given the task of reporting on the enemy movements, sending in tactical reports of the situation, and was permitted to harass small bodies of the enemy. With the diversion in the south underway, and the enemy hopefully distracted, the other 3 groups would concentrate in the Sollum to Tobruk area. The primary group would be 30 Corps, with the Cruiser and M3 light tanks. This force would move through the area between Sidi Omar and Fort Medellina, an area undefended, and then strike towards Tobruk. They would fight a decisive armoured battle near Tobruk, and after they'd won it, the Tobruk garrison would launch an attack out of Tobruk and link up with the relieving forces. At the same time, 13th Corps with the infantry and infantry tanks would envelop and attack into the Bardia area. Pockets of enemy forces would then be eliminated. But between the 2 corps would be a centre force consisting of 1 armoured brigade. This brigade is there to prevent the enemy striking between the 2 forces and into the British flank or rear areas. We'll come back to look at this force later. After some discussion between Auchinleck and Cunningham, the idea of an independent centre force was discarded. Instead, 30th Corps was simply ordered to prevent Axis armour from attacking the left flank of 13th Corps. Also, Cunningham decided that, in order to destroy the German panzers, the British armour would advance to the central position near Gabra Saleh. It could then move towards Tobruk or towards Bardia depending on how Rommel reacted. And here is the main point of the Crusader plan. 30 Corps would move to Gabra Saleh, stop, and wait for Rommel to counterattack them. And when Rommel did counterattack, which was thought he would do on the first day, the British would fight and win this decisive tank battle, after which they would dominate the battlefield and then relieve Tobruk. So, yes, the British offensive wasn't really an offensive. It was actually a forward movement, then they would dig in, hand the initiative to the enemy, which is something you normally don't want to do, then wait for the enemy to attack them. So the offensive was actually a defensive. And the linchpin of this entire plan relied on the enemy counterattacking the offensive, which wasn't really an offensive. So I'm going to underline and emphasize this. In order for this plan to work, Rommel has to counterattack. So the obvious question is, what happens if he doesn't? Cunningham thought that Rommel would react on the first day, and if he didn't, Cunningham would then decide what to do next. So the British have no backup plan if Rommel decides to play defensively in a battle in which he was the defender. And yet, Auchinleck accepted the Cunningham plan. And I will point this out, because I will get called out for it, this isn't just hindsight speaking here. Some of the British commanders had doubts about the plan at the time, as we'll see. So, yeah, this plan has a very obvious flaw in it, and the British knew this going into the battle. But the plan was accepted, so Cunningham set about filling in the details. For Crusader, huge forces needed to be sent to the front, and armies march on their stomach. In fact, the front was currently 130 miles, 209 kilometres from the existing railhead, and another 80 miles, 128 kilometres from there to the upcoming battle area. Therefore, improvements would have to be made to British logistics if they were to send an entire army westwards and then maintain it. So, by the 15th of November, the railway was extended to Mashifa at a rate of 2 miles a day. This was achieved by 2 New Zealand railway construction companies, supported by various pioneer and labour units. The water pipeline was also extended from El Dabba, 160 miles, 257 kilometres of piping and pumping stations are created, allowing more quantities of precious water to reach the troops. Due to mishaps and accidents, the rehydration of British forces wasn't completed until the 13th of November. This is partly why Auchinleck had to delay the attack. The troops needed water and a supply base in order to launch the attack. However, even now water was strictly rationed, with each man getting 3/4 of a UK gallon, which is 3.4 litres, per day to drink. And because the plan didn't require the early capture of Helfea, Sollum and Bardia, supplies couldn't just drive up the coastal road, and there weren't any ports to land supplies until Tobruk was relieved. So the British realised that large quantities of supplies needed to be built up prior to the offensive and placed as far west as possible. Therefore, 3 forward supply bases were organised, each stocked with 1 week of supplies. One was in the south near Jerabub for the Oasis Group, one was at Thalata for 30 Corps, and the last one was at Sidi Barani for 13th Corps. At the height of the build-up, 180,000 gallons of petrol, 818,000 litres, was consumed per day just to bring supplies up to the front supply dumps. It's no wonder that several delays were suffered simply by building up the supplies needed for the offensive, and these delays would cause Auchinleck to shift back the start of the attack until the 18th of November. In addition to the main dumps, 6 smaller field maintenance centres were also established closer to the front to ship supplies to the troops. Each field maintenance centre consisted of a field supply depot, a field ammunition depot, a water issue section, prisoners' cages, field post officers, salvage dumps, various other stores, and units to deal with stragglers. 4 FMCs were provided for 30 Corps and 2 for 13th Corps. So successful was this system that these became a permanent feature in 8th Army. Right, with the setup complete, let's look at the evolution of the plan. On the 6th and 21st of October, Cunningham explained his intentions to his corps commanders, who later passed down their orders to the divisional troops. When Norrie heard of the plan, he was very critical of several elements. First, he thought that 4th Armoured Brigade should stay with 30th Corps and not guard the left flank of 13th Corps, because he thought this would dilute British tank strength prior to the decisive tank battle which they hoped to fight. Basically, he wanted to use all of his armour to fight the enemy panzers, which makes perfect sense. But he also couldn't understand why the armour should advance to Gabra-Salur and then just stop. Gabra-Salur had no military significance to the Germans, so why would Rommel react and come after the British if they were there? Norrie thought that Rommel wouldn't react on the first day if the British moved to Gabra-Salur, and if anything this would hand Rommel the initiative. Rommel would then have the opportunity to strike back wherever he wanted, so instead Norrie proposed a drive straight for Tobruk, which would definitely prompt Rommel to react. Both General Cunningham and Godwin-Austen disagreed. They thought 13th Corps might be able to stop an attack by one panzer division, but he wouldn't be able to survive an attack by both. Therefore, if the tanks went off to Tobruk, Rommel would have the opportunity to strike at 13th Corps with all of his panzers. Even Freyberg got involved, writing later, "I made it clear that I did not agree with the plan to go into the blue against unbeaten armoured formations unless I had tanks under my immediate command. It's on this basis that Godwin-Austen was demanding control of 4th Armoured Brigade Group to protect the left flank of the corps. And it seems 13th Corps was deeply worried about the panzer counterattack, which is why they wanted both tank protection and didn't want 30th Corps advancing to Tobruk. Of course, it's worth pointing out the underlying reason for the infantry units to request armoured support is because of the out-of-date British tank doctrine. Godwin-Austen insisted on specific flank protection. Though infantry divisions were equipped with anti-tank guns and field artillery, the infantry also believed the Hobartian doctrine that only tanks could fight tanks. And throughout the battle, there were to be constant local pleas on the infantry's part for armoured escort. Cunningham, however, compromised. He decided that 4th Armoured Brigade would remain in Norrie's command, but said that Norrie would be responsible for protecting the flank of 13th Corps. This is perhaps why Garrison was chosen as 30 Corps' destination. He also emphasised that this was only a temporary arrangement until the panzers were defeated. Even then, the question was raised: what would happen if 4th Armoured Brigade Group was needed by both 13th and 30th Corps? And when no satisfactory answer was given, of course, Freyberg complained again. However, the armoured formation leaders insisted that in order to win the tank battle, they needed to maintain their concentration of force, and the plan remained as it was. In his effort to satisfy Godwin-Austen and Freyberg, Cunningham refused to allow 30th Corps to move straight to Tobruk, thinking Garrison was a good objective. However, this was a flat, stony part of the desert that was open and wouldn't offer defensive advantages to the British if the Germans did counterattack. So it's clear that this area wasn't chosen for tactical reasons. It really does look as though Cunningham chose Garrison because this was a compromise between the tank corps' wish to remain concentrated and the infantry's wish to be protected by armour. If the armour went off towards Tobruk, the infantry flank would be exposed, which means at least some of 30 Corps' tanks would have to be diverted to protect 13th Corps' flank, and thus not be available for the decisive tank battle they were hoping for. But Norrie remained unconvinced and was unhappy about the plan, at least according to his post-war writings. On the 9th of November, he and Cunningham watched a war game rehearsal by 7th Armoured Division. Norrie was able to show that Rommel may not react to the British at Garrison, and insisted that they should instead drive onto Sidi Rezai. Cunningham now began to have doubts about his own plan. These doubts became so large that he decided to go with Norrie's HQ in the first few days of the battle so he could decide what to do if Rommel didn't react. Again, another compromise. However, the plan remained unchanged. The British would drive to Garrison and sit there waiting for Rommel to react. And we have to consider the psychological effect that these doubts were having on a man who was already under a lot of pressure. Cunningham had been a very heavy pipe smoker, but had recently given up because his optician told him it was probably the smoking that was affecting one of his eyes. He was thus under strain prior to the battle, and also now had doubts about his own compromised battle plan. It's worth remembering this when we get into the battle. Looking at the individual units, we can also see why things were stressful. Gott's 7th Armoured Division was ordered to advance northwest, find and destroy the enemy's armour, and protect the left flank of 13th Corps. 7th Armoured Brigade would go up the centre, straight to Garrison. 22nd Armoured Brigade would move to Bir el Gubi, and 4th Armoured Brigade would move on the right flank to protect the left flank of 13th Corps. Campbell's 7th Support Group would be held back to either support 7th or 22nd Armoured Brigades depending on what Rommel did. And this is all great, but if you look at the map, 7th Armoured Division would be dispersed over a wide area. Their strength would be diluted, making it very difficult to fight this supposed decisive armoured battle. Yet nobody seems to have noticed this, least of all Gott. In addition, because 22nd Armoured Brigade hadn't arrived until the 14th of October, it was expected in mid-September, this then left the inexperienced 22nd Armoured Brigade barely 4 weeks to train for its first desert offensive. There were also other problems. 1st South African Division was ordered to protect the communications of 7th Armoured Division on its western flank. The decision to use Brink's 1st South African Division after its triumph in Ethiopia was a good one. However, the 1st South African Division hadn't received all her vehicles in time for the initial advance, and its first task was to restore and extend the fortifications at Mersa-Matruh. Not only did this affect their efficiency for the coming battle, but it obviously affected the morale of men who had volunteered for active military duties, and now found themselves continually employed as static labourers. In addition, the replacements from South Africa were so inadequate in terms of numbers and in the quality of their training that the decision was made to reduce the division to just 2 brigades. The South African troops were keen to get into action, but the quality of the division had deteriorated from the glory days in Ethiopia to the time of Crusader. Worse, Cunningham wanted the South Africans to play a central role in Crusader. When Brink said that his men required more time for training, Cunningham gave Brink an ultimatum. Either Brink let Cunningham know in time that his division was ready to fight, or their role in the battle would be reduced. It was surely a most unfair burden to place upon the shoulders of a subordinate commander, especially of a Dominion formation anxious to uphold its reputation and again prove its loyalty to the mother country. Upon this decision, Brink felt he had little choice, and he wrote in his diary. The die was cast, however. The division was already on the move to its concentration area, and the honour of South Africa was at stake. Churchill's pressure upon Auchinleck had clearly rolled downhill to the bottom. It is impossible to explain to Parliament and the nation how it is our Middle East armies have had to stand for 4.5 months without engaging the enemy. For 13th Corps, the order was to pin down and cut off the enemy's troops on the Egyptian frontier and then advance westwards. And the Indian and New Zealand divisions were high quality troops, suitable for the task ahead. They also had tank support which would come in handy. And the 2nd South African Division would remain in reserve. The Tobruk garrison was also ordered to prepare for its sortie. So what we have here is a plan with a simple goal: engage and defeat the enemy armour with your armour. But when you look into the details, things get a little bit more complicated and cracks start to appear. The armour was mostly in one corps, but then was diluted and had little to no infantry and artillery support. The plan involved handing the initiative to the enemy, and even then there was no guarantees that Rommel would react, and the quality of both troops and equipment was in doubt. The fact that Cunningham had had to compromise several times and had decided to accompany one corps commander in case the enemy didn't react at all, in itself is an indication that this plan wasn't shaping up very well. And we haven't even seen what the enemy's doing yet. Clearly, Operation Crusader was not a flawless plan, and the British leadership are entirely to blame for this. So, it's time we look at what the Axis were up to. Next Monday we will look at Rommel, the Afrika Korps, the Italians and their weapons, and look at the most cunning plan made by our most beloved general of the Second World War, Franz Halder. Oh yes, Halder is at it again with another diabolical scheme to prevent the Axis from winning the war. And yes, I did say that correctly, the Axis. Thanks for watching, bye for now.